Okay, in this section, we're going to go over preventive medicine, nutraceuticals, and aging and wellness. And obviously, the application for this information isn't just nutraceuticals. We're going to talk about clinical applications with lifestyle medicine, other factors as well. But as far as nutraceuticals go, we're going to go over the research. So our goal in this section is to review the limitations of study designs for nutraceuticals research and longevity, literature review of nutraceuticals that may impact aging pathways. And then our clinical objective is review clinical applications that may support healthy aging. Okay, so let's talk about the limitations of longevity studies in general, and then how they also apply to the nutraceuticals. We kind of touched upon this. When you look at humans, and humans are, let's say, living between 80 to 100 years of age, average, let's say, recent average is around 90 years of age. There are no long-term longevity studies of any nutraceutical that's been given to humans and been monitored for the 50-year lifespan or any of those things. There's like the Nurse with Health Study database and some of these prospective databases where some information comes out of. But most of the research that you're seeing out there being talked about with longevity genes and how things impact longevity genes have been done with animals, organisms that have a very short lifespan. So that's one of the things that it's important to understand. And the other thing is that there are studies done obviously on various factors associated with longevity, like nutraceuticals that affect cardiovascular risk in clinical trials, like essential fatty acids, especially fish oils have had multiple clinical trials and meta-analysis studies to show they have a really protective role in cardiovascular disease. But when it comes to like longevity genes, they're really limited to animal studies. Now, you have to remember that that's just the way it is. There's just limitations of longevity studies in humans altogether. One of the main issues is the length of study, the lifespan. So the lifespan of a human is longer than these other organisms. It's hard to design studies in one generation. So unless you're having a research lab pass the research to another group of researchers to another group of researchers over time to get some data, it's very hard to do lifespan studies of any kind of nutraceutical. There's a lot of confounding variables when it comes to all the things that can happen during the lifespan that have to be considered into a study design, which makes it very difficult. Compliance of subjects, how long does a subject actually stay on the nutraceutical? Do they actually stay on for the rest of their life? Do they decide to do something else? That's even with short clinical trials of 6 to 8 weeks, compliance is a huge issue. So imagine a study done over a lifespan for compliance. Number of subjects to reach statistical significance. This is another huge one. When you have an effect size that's small, so there's nothing that has a huge impact on longevity. There isn't like a pill you take that increases your lifespan at 10 years overnight. There's going to be things that have little tiny effect sizes. And when you have things that have little tiny effect sizes and you try to calculate the statistical significance you need for your study design, you end up needing a lot of people. So if you have a lot of subjects you need, that becomes not feasible when you look at cost and recruitment and compliance. And then all those things lead to cost of study. To do like a long lifespan study with large number of subjects would be very difficult and very, very expensive. And then lack of motivation for investigators, like what's their point? A lot of this research, if they start, will never get done in their career and their lifespan. And all these things means that we just are going to be limited in ever getting double randomized clinical trials on any kind of nutraceutical or any kind of even drug intervention for extending human lifespan. So that's just something to be aware of. So we have to look at things that can change genes and change expressions that we can then translate into potential mechanisms that work. Now, when you look at animal models of longevity, they're basically your roundworm, your fly, and your mouse. So most of the studies that looked at activating these genetic genes like AMPK, mTOR, sirtuin genes are really done primarily in these three organisms. And there's a review paper that you have in your notes. There's a couple of them I put in there for you. Here we go. Here's all the different, you can just list all the different organisms. Like here's a yeast culture. Then you have some roundworms over here, some flies, and they show, like, for example, quercetin or curcumin or alpha-tocopherol has extension of lifespan, or increases oxidative stress or decreases oxidative stress has little effect. And these are done just because of their short lifespan. And in this paper that was published and available, you can see that there are some fish studies. Then they break it down by nutraceutical and by organism, whether it's autophagy or mTOR or sirtuin. But these are really done in these organisms. Now, that's okay. It's the best we can do with the research question we have. Here's another paper that was published in 2019, and they looked at different nutraceuticals and human longevity, but they looked at certain markers that you can look in humans. So you'll see them mention some human trials, like berberine clearly has been shown to impact type 2 diabetes markers. There's even meta-analyses on that. So this review paper in 2019 in Trends in Endocrinology and Metabolism definitely has more than animal studies and has some human studies. And these are translatable to some of the effects of some of these mechanisms, but they're not necessarily changing lifespan. And if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is a registry for clinical trials, like this one, you can see, there's some studies being done on vitamin D. They're trying to get metformin and rapamycin approved as anti-aging or longevity medications. The FDA is still concerned about even making that category available. But could you imagine if they had a FDA-approved drug for aging, rapamycin, and they wanted everyone in the world to take it? It would be a multi-billion-dollar blockbuster drug. But as far as clinical trials go, there isn't really much. And it's going to be very difficult to do anything for lifespan, but there are some things that increase risk factors and maybe expression of these genes. So those are the limitations we have when we look at the literature when it comes to nutraceuticals. Now, the way I organize a section of the notes for you to kind of put all the information together for you is breaking down which nutraceuticals impact longevity genes and pathways, which nutraceuticals have been shown to impact hallmarks and pillars of aging, which nutraceuticals really impact most of these windows or have a pleiotropic effect or an effect on many different target sites, and then nutraceuticals support resiliency. And ultimately, when we practice functional medicine, we have a personalized medicine model where every single person has a different and unique treatment plan and nutraceuticals targeted for whatever the clinical goals are, specifically for that patient. So, you as a clinician will have to decide what's best for them, but these are the different categories of nutraceuticals. So let's start with nutraceuticals that impact these genetic pathways. The main nutraceuticals in spermidine, resveratrol, and ribonicotinamide, or a different form of niacin. And here you can see another chart where this is reviewed: quercetin, rapamycin, resveratrol, and you can see flavonoids all over the place. And I made a chart for you that summarizes all of the main ones. Doesn't include all of them. And I tried to include the ones that had more human evidence than fly and roundworm and yeast or organism, but they do include those. So it is just the way it is. Now let's go over each of these in more detail. Sirtuins specifically. So when we look at sirtuins, there's different sirtuins. We know there's at least 6 known sirtuin pathways: sirtuin 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and they have different effects. Like the sirtuin 1 pathway has an effect on inflammation and fat production and mitochondrial biogenesis and genomic stability and DNA repair. So all the things that we want, like helping repair damaged DNA and helping with inflammation and helping with mitochondrial biogenesis, can be impacted by turning on sirtuin 1. And there's been some popularity of niacin, but converted niacin. So NMN you can see here, and an NR. NMN is nicotinamide dinucleotide, and NR is the riboside version of that, nicotinamide mononucleotide riboside. And these two types of converted niacin compounds have been shown to help activate these sirtuin genes in animal models. Now, there are nutraceutical companies that are that have made these available. They're very, very expensive. It's like $100, $200 for a month supply of these nicotinamide supplements. They've only, at this point, have been shown to have some effect on animal studies, but it is a nutraceutical that is available. And then these different sirtuin activations with these nicotinamide supplements seem to impact more than one sirtuin pathway. So there's sirtuins 3, 4, and 5 that are found within the mitochondria. And then there's sirtuins 2 that are extracellular, sirtuins 1 and 6, which are intracellular. And they're looking at the different effects of all these. But for the most part, turning on these sirtuin pathways can help things like mitochondrial homeostasis and insulin signaling pathways. And it seems supportive right now that these niacin compounds are helping them. NMN compound seems to be more popular than the other ones just because of marketing and what's available. But the other key thing that's been shown to help these is resveratrol. So resveratrol has been shown to reverse FOX1 transcriptional responses and activate the sirtuin-1 pathways. So you'll see resveratrol is a very popular supplement for trying to activate these sirtuin pathways. So the nicotinamides and the resveratrol are very popular for these support pathways. There's a researcher, Dr. David Sinclair, at Harvard Medical School. He discovered, I believe, one of the first sirtuins in yeast, and he's a big advocate of taking nicotinamide and resveratrol. He takes it every day himself, and he says, I know the research hasn't shown it has an impact in human clinical trials, but I believe it's translatable into human research, and I think he's probably right. So when you're looking at main things that are impacting these sirtuin pathways itself, it's things that boost NAD. So the nicotinamide riboside, the nicotinamide adenonucleotide, NMN and NR, and resveratrol. Those are the main nutraceuticals. And when you look at the research on this, resveratrol for sure has phenomenal research on every major part of aging. So that you can give it 5 stars. Probably one of the most impactful. You definitely want to use a trans resveratrol. It seems to have better flavonoid activity. And then when you look at NMN, nicotinamide mononucleotide, which helps with the NAD pathways. So these NMN substances and NR substances, they help with NAD. These NAD elevations turn on these sirtuin pathways. These sirtuin pathways then impact all the different hallmarks of aging. So animal studies so far have indicated positive outcomes for cardiovascular function. Human studies only studied and found oral ingestion is safely tolerated. Randomized clinical trials are currently being conducted for cardiometabolic outcomes, but we'll have to wait and see on those. And then animal studies indicate for NR, animal studies indicate positive outcomes for reduction in fat mass, improvement in insulin sensitivity, and improved vascular functions. And human studies have only studied and found oral ingestion is safely tolerated. So I've had personally used NMN myself and have had talked to about patients and so forth. And the bottom line is you don't really notice anything. Like when you take it, there's some people that have told me that when they've taken it, they've had a little bit more energy, feel a little bit better, but it's nothing that's dramatic in my experience. And also, I think there's a lot of promise there. So if the cost is not an issue for a person, then fine. Maybe if they just want to do anything they can that has some promise to turn on the sirtuins, this is one of the few things, plus resveratrol, that could do that. For sure, resveratrol has so many other benefits besides activating sirtuins that it should definitely be considered as a daily supplement. I personally take resveratrol every single day. But NMN, when you have patients that have budgets and they're not sure if they should take it or not, and there isn't enough research or stuff to support it, it becomes something where you need to have the discussion with the patient and say, hey, this is one of those things that's shown in some animal studies to impact these pathways associated with longevity that are very, very important. But it's an expensive supplement, and you may not notice anything dramatically different in your function when you take it. Okay. Now, there may be some people who take it and have a huge impact. I haven't worked with a large population, so I can only tell you from my small population sample that I've worked with. But NMN And NMN being more readily available as a nutraceutical you can find online on Amazon, different manufacturers make it, has a lot of promise of turning on NAD and the expression of these sirtuin pathways. Now, other flavonoids that have also been shown on sirtuin pathways are curcumin, green tea extract, and rhubarb. But resveratrol, if you're going to use one and you want to use one that also has a lot of support for every other pathway, you definitely want to use resveratrol. And the question always comes, how much? And we don't know. There isn't an exact number. How do you translate the number of resveratrol used in yeast organisms to humans? But we know with human studies, several hundred milligrams, 200 to 500 milligrams. I prefer 2,000 to 5,000 milligrams. People take 5,000 milligrams. Some people, once they get past 2,000 or 3,000 milligrams, have some digestive discomfort and diarrhea. But definitely above 500 milligrams of resveratrol would be a good idea, just based on other studies how resveratrol has protective effects on individuals. Okay. Now, if we switch into mTOR pathway, we know that mTOR is a central regulator of lifespan. And rapamycin being the key medication they found that impacts the expression of this. And nutraceuticals that have been shown to impact mTOR to support longevity are quercetin, coffee flavonoids, magnesium, alpha-ketoglutarate. And I think it's very clear that coffee has gotten a bum rap in natural medicine. More and more research shows that flavonoids in coffee are so protective. Numerous papers published now on the protective effects on dementia and Alzheimer's disease with regular coffee drinkers. Coffee and the caffeine in coffee is one of the key things that helps people to do time-restricted fasting because it's an appetite suppressant. So some people just drink coffee to extend their time between dinner and breakfast and still maintain function. Now, obviously, coffee could be an issue for those that can't handle any stimulants. Like if someone has an issue with stimulants or metabolizes caffeine inefficiently, they're going to get wired on caffeine. If someone's got adrenal exhaustion, they can't handle the stimulation, coffee may not be a good idea. But also, if you remember from the cardiovascular cross institute course, if you took the course, we went over all the studies and research with people that have hypertension, and they found even people with hypertension that drink coffee have no real significant difference in their hypertension and even risk. So you still want to be careful. I mean, obviously, those that have hypertension, you want to be careful with coffee. But for most people, coffee flavonoids seem to have lots of effects all throughout the body. And one of them in organism studies is in the mTOR pathway. And then we get into the AMPK pathway. AMPK is critical for turning on energy pathways. It optimizes autophagy, fatty acid synthesis, fatty acid oxidation, using fat for energy, clearing out debris, limiting cancer growth, all the things that we want. This is the chart that just reviews all the main steps of what activating AMPK does, but it basically makes fuel efficiency, energy production much more efficient in the body and helps get rid of protein aggregates and debris. And the main AMPK stimulator that's been published and studied so far has been metformin. Metformin has really powerful effects and clear effects on this AMPK pathway and even potentially secondarily on the sirtuin pathway. And the nutraceutical potential equivalent to metformin is berberine. So berberine also has been shown to turn on AMPK pathways, and berberine has been used effectively now in humans trials where it's been shown to reduce fasting glucose levels, HbA1c levels, triglycerides, cholesterol, LDL levels. So berberine seems to have the same impacts on the AMPK as metformin does. And this was a study that was published. It was a meta-analysis looking at the effects of berberine in the treatment of type 2 diabetes, and a meta-analysis comparing the outcome of 27 randomized controlled trials that included 2,569 patients, where they looked at berberine versus placebo, or berberine with lifestyle intervention versus lifestyle. Just so in these group studies, these meta-analyses all found a favorable outcome with berberine. So berberine seems to have a very clear positive impact in clinical trials. The meta-analysis clearly show that it has a glucose and lipid lowering effect in studies. This was another meta-analysis that was done and it was titled Meta-Analysis of the Effect of Safety of Berberine Treatment of Type 2 Diabetes with Hyperlipidemia and Hypertension. And it said, conclusion, the study indicates that berberine has comparable therapeutic effects on type 2 diabetes, hyperlipidemia, hypertension with no serious side effects. Considering the relatively low cost compared with other first-line medication and treatments, berberine might be as good alternative to low socioeconomic status patients to treat type 2 diabetes, hyperlipidemia, hypertension over a long period of time. So there's been so many human clinical trials on berberine that there have been multiple types of meta-analyses where they look at composite scores of clinical trials. And they've all shown to be favorable in impacting these AMPK and genetic pathways as well as other pathways that are really show a lot of support for improving the nutrient sensing pathway and the hallmarks of aging. Okay. Berberine has also been shown to attenuate tight junction loss in vitro models of intestinal epithelial cells, so leaky gut patterns, at least in vitro studies. And then when they looked at using berberine with people that have PCOS, they found that berberine was actually much more effective than metformin and had less side effects. So there's a lot of promise for berberine being one of the key things that can be used for longevity. We know it helps with type 2 diabetes. We know it outperforms metformin in some of these clinical trials. And we know it's very tolerable with it. But the key thing with berberine to remember is that berberine can also lower blood sugar levels. So if you're using it as a routine nutraceutical, you want to be careful with hypoglycemics. So the typical dose you see in these clinical trials and studies is about 200 milligrams per day. People that have diabetes and blood sugar issues, it's very common for clinicians to use 200 milligrams per meal to really get their blood sugar levels under control. But it is definitely a key AMPK activator. Other AMPK activators that have been done in studies are resveratrol, organisms, resveratrol, curcumin, rosehips, burdock-root, alpha-lipoic acid, and green tea extract. So that's an important pathway. And then as we get into this insulin-like growth factor signaling pathway of genetic expression, where it really impacts stress resilience and overall efficiency metabolism and cancer protection, we know that these pathways are activated with caloric restriction. Insulin signaling has a major impact on this pathway as well. And the main compounds that can impact this in studies have been found have been berberine, curcumin, and resveratrol. And then if we look at autophagy pathways, autophagy, again, being how we get rid of these damaged, garbage particles in our tissues and cells through lysosomal pathways. The very few things, spermidine. Spermidine, you can see it's typically an extract coming from wheat. Unfortunately, most of the spermidine products that are used are not gluten-free. Curcumin, quercetin, berberine are all natural compounds that have some effects on supporting autophagy. Spermidine being the most effective one. But again, you got to be careful with people that have gluten intolerances and the source of spermidine that's used, since it's typically wheat sources that are not gluten-free. Then you have the NRF2 pathway. NRF2 pathway is really critical for mitochondrial biogenesis and protecting the mitochondria. And here you can see studies where NFR2 pathways impact mitochondrial homeostasis and protect DNA and all the things we want with the hallmarks of aging. And then here you can see a review paper that goes into details about how NRF2 regulation really impacts all different pathways of cell metabolism and inflammation. Many of these overlap the hallmarks of aging. And the main nutraceuticals that impact the NRF2 pathway are green tea extract, sulforain. You find things like in broccoli, curcumin, black pepper, N-acetylcysteine, resveratrol, green tea extract. Those are all the main NRF2 supporting supplements. And then you have what are called senolytics. Senolytics impact the senescence pathways and deal with that sensory associated secretory phenotype of these cells that take place through aging. Remember that when cells become senescent, and they can only go through cell division, and they increase these inflammatory mediators, and these inflammatory mediators then create this like feed-forward vicious cycle. They cause tissue inflammation all throughout the body, and this was a review paper that went into all the different papers published, and these polyphenols, specifically these list of polyphenols here on the right, were evaluated to all have some anti-senescence activity, especially these ones on the right. So you can see the sources of some of these anti-senescent ones, and ultimately anti-senescent compounds are trying partly to deal with the inflammatory mediators that are releasing the senescent cells. They're not necessarily stopping cells from becoming senescent. They're just protecting the inflammatory mediators that they're releasing. So here's a list of all the different natural ones that was published in this review paper that you can take a look at as well. So here you have your senolytics that involve green tea. You can see is there curcumin, resveratrol, spermidine. These are all senolytics. You can see green tea is actually all over the place here. There's a bunch of things that are all over the place we'll talk about. So the senolytic compounds are there. Now, when we get into nutraceuticals for the hallmarks of aging, that's a whole different category. So one way of looking at, okay, so what are the nutraceuticals that impact longevity? It's the nutraceuticals that are used to impact each of these gene pathways. And when you look at nutraceuticals to impact each of these gene pathways, you have that chart. So you can go through and go, okay, how much of these do I want to take? Most of these are really limited to human studies. And I would say you should be taking a handful of different flavonoids all the time. And you can realize that most flavonoids have both antioxidant properties and various impacts of these longevity genes. Antioxidants have the ability to quench free radicals. These all have free radical properties. But when you look at things like quercetin and resveratrol and curcumin and green tea and extract, they directly have the potential to turn on these longevity genes. So if you're looking at the literature and trying to go, okay, well, I'm going to accept that I'm not going to be able to see long-term human longevity studies with nutraceuticals because of limitation of study design, then I'm going to have to translate some of that information to human interventions, and also maybe assume that some of these interventions that are impacting the outcomes of aging, like heart disease, with things like berberine and resveratrol, may be useful. Then that would be your list. Okay. So now if we go and look at which nutraceuticals to take based on doing a literature review of the hallmarks of aging, we have a whole different other set of compounds. So here we can start with, the hallmarks of aging. And remember, the hallmarks of aging is a theory where you want to target the expression of these various science pathways to avoid disease. So you target aging before disease gets there by really trying to dampen the expression of these variables, right? DNA damage, telomere shortening, epigenetic regulation, alkaline gene induction, reactive metabolites, senescent cells, inflammaging, stem cell exhaustion, and amplification of the senescent cells with these SASP compounds. So when you look at a lot of these issues, they're related to things that cause damage to tissues. Environmental toxins, ionizing radiations, ultraviolet light, smoking, Western diet. Those are really the things that have a huge impact on the molecular damaging side of compounds. So when you look at things like genes being unstable and destroyed, telomere attrition, and epigenetic alterations, these are the nutraceuticals that support those pathways. Okay. CoQ10, vitamin E, vitamin A, beta-carotene, alpha-lipoic acid, N-acetylcysteine, glutathione, B12 folate, and then I put in there hepatic biotransformation nutraceuticals. These are just things that helps your body get rid of chemicals that your body can biotransform, right? There's persistent pollutants which you get exposed to, which are hard to excrete out of your body. They don't go through phase 1, phase 2 pathways. And then there's non-persistent pollutants like BPA and bisphenol A and different types of toxins and phytates and other compounds that can be biotransformed. And that's where those come in. When it comes to treatment applications, we'll talk about that more. But fundamentally, any antioxidant, like if you want to preserve your genome and prevent DNA damage, you want to have antioxidants in your system, high amounts. And, the question comes like, can you get it really from food if it's organic or not organic? I don't think so. And I think there's a level to optimizing it. And and depending on where you live and what your activities are and what you do, I just don't see it. I just don't see the food quality being available to do it. And I think the amount of environmental pollution and stress we have, and then when you're dealing with people that have high degrees of endogenous oxidative stress and inflammation, like the people we all see in practice, whether they have diabetes or they have insulin permeability, have Crohn's or ulcerative colitis or celiac disease or some kind of inflammatory condition. I think if that inflammation is high, and it's always going to be high, they're always going to get a high amount, or people are going to get high amounts of environmental airborne pollution of where they live, they're always going to have more free radical activity than what their body can probably make. So it makes a good idea to take antioxidants. Okay. This was a review paper, Journal of Nutrition Biochemistry, and they went into DNA damage is a big issue, telomerase activity is a big issue, telomerase length is a big issue. What are some potential strategies based on the evidence? And they're like, okay, tea tree, omega-3 fatty acids, grapeseed extract, polyphenols, curcumin, antioxidants like vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin A, fiber D, zinc, folate. These could all be critical things to consider when you're looking at DNA and telomere protection and repair. And when you look at factors that impact telomere shortening, stress of all types, smoking habits, these can all damage this. And, really the only strategies have been shown to impact telomere shortening, there isn't a drug for this. It's your nutritional status, your antioxidant levels, your physical activity, your food intake, meaning if you have too much caloric intake, you shorten your telomeres quicker than someone who doesn't have overconsumption of calories. And then free radical alcohol consumption, toxic aldehydes that can take place, they can all cause issues. And then they've also found people that have obesity have greater inflammation. Their body fat themselves creates inflammatory reactive oxygen species that can damage telomeres. So there's a link between body fat, percentage of a person, and the amount of free radicals they produce endogenously unrelated to environmental toxins that can damage telomeres. So looking at just diet and lifestyle to impact obesity are factors. And this was the paper that was published in Therapeutic Foods. And they were looking at the concerns for epigenetic influences and DNA methylation pathways. And it's the flavonoids. Green tea, curcumin, quercetin, resveratrol. Those are all the bioactive compounds that study after study shows to help those mechanisms. So those are things to definitely consider when it comes to protecting structures and tissues and so forth. Then as we get into the mitochondria pathways and mitochondrial dysfunction unrelated to injury, things like antioxidants, CoQ10, D-ribose, beta-hydroxybutyrate, carnitine, flavonoids, creatine monohydrate, B vitamins, magnesium, those can all be useful. In the Krasny Institute Fatigue and Pain course, we went into the mitochondria in great detail, talked about the specific actions of these nutraceuticals in great detail. But for here, we could just look at this study here where it looked at foods that have high amounts of flavonoids and antioxidants, like fish, polyunsaturated fatty acids, lots of colorful foods and plants, theoretically, they can provide flavonoids, but you may need higher doses than those. But they impact these PGC1 alpha pathways, which protect the mitochondria. And when you look at things to make them cofactors and micronutrients to make the mitochondria more efficient, basically your B vitamins, magnesium, manganese, alpha lipoic acid. So when you're looking at trying to optimize mitochondrial dysfunction and aging, this would be your list. Then if you're looking at the dysregulated nutrient sensing pathway, berberine, vanadium, resveratrol, B vitamins, alpha lipoic acid come up. And as you look at loss of proteostasis, the ability to clear rid of debris, berberine, spermidine, curcumin, quercetin come up, and adaptation to stress, adaptogens like ashwagandha, ginseng, and rhodiola become a possibility. And for inflammation, the considerations would be resveratrol, curcumin, and glutathione. Now, when you look at all these different nutraceuticals, that's a lot of different things. So do you take every single one? Of course not. And what do we do? So in a clinical setting, we might have to, depends on what our goals are, depends on what we're trying to accomplish. And then a clinical setting, it may be different than we want to do for ourselves for prevention, right? Typically, healthcare practitioners have more of a open-mindedness to doing more interventional things for prevention than someone who's not in the healthcare field themselves, because they're focused on other things in their life. But when you're seeing chronic disease in your office all the time, and you see people that have chronic disease that actually do have a healthy lifestyle, you start to think, well, maybe there's some extra additional protection that may be beneficial. Then the question becomes, which ones would you take? So the concept of pleiotropic nutraceuticals becomes an option. What that pleiotropy means is you try to pick nutraceuticals that have an impact in multiple pathways or multiple genes. So pleiotropy refers to disorders where multiple seemingly unrelated organ systems are affected. And this is a paper that was published looking at, okay, so how do you impact these longevity genes? What are the best things you can use to have the greatest impact? And then right away, they're like, well, resveratrol's on top of the list. Resveratrol hits the serine pathways, AMPK pathways, mTOR pathways, all these different links and mechanisms that are involved with the aging process, cancer development, and so forth. And if you look at the list we had of longevity genes, look how often resveratrol pops up. It's all over the place. Sirtuins, AMPK, IS pathway, NFR2, senolytics. So I would say resveratrol should definitely be on top of your list. And then when you look at other pleiotropic compounds, the other one they listed was curcumin. And they went through and discussed all the different pathways. Curcumin has been shown to help with senescence, autophagy, and even things like sirtuin pathway activation. And if you look at the supplements for genetic expressions, you can see curcumin is all over the place. So curcumin has major effects. And they also listed berberine. So berberine, definitely a very powerful AMPK stimulator. And in human clinical trials, very effective for type 2 diabetes and hyperlipidemia and risk factors, cardiovascular disease. So berberine can also be something that you want to consider. So when you take this entire list and go, well, with all these supplements, which are the ones that have the pleiotropic effect, that have impact on multiple systems, what are they? Or another question that would probably happen in a real life setting is, so what do you take? What do you recommend? After reading everything, putting together, what would you take? So this would be my list right here. Pleiotropic supplements. Resveratrol, 500 to 3,000 milligram. I personally take everything at the end, 3,000 milligrams. Curcuminoids, 3,000 milligrams. Berberine, 500 milligrams. Green tea extract, 500 to 3,000 milligrams. Okay? So these would be the most important ones that would have impacts on many of the genetic pathways. Now, unrelated to things we talked about, essential fatty acids. Because when you actually look at all the different seminars we put together in the CrossFit did so far, and you look at the research on cardiovascular disease being the number one cause of death, and you look at the meta-analyses and so much research behind clinical trials on essential fatty acids, especially EPA and DHA, preventing cardiovascular incident, to the point where if there's ever a nutraceutical malpractice, it would be nutraceutical malpractice, not give everyone with heart disease essential fatty acids, EPA, DHA. I would definitely put that on the list. And essential fatty acids also are critical for cancer protection and just systemic inflammation, and really important for just general cellular membrane function, neuron function, and prostaglandin balance. And then coffee or tea. And we're going to go over this research a little bit later, but 2 cups per day of at least coffee or tea, rich in high amounts of flavonoids, especially if they can be used in a social setting with a loved one or a friend where you can talk and discuss things. Those are all things that impact longevity. But if you were to look at one model, and this doesn't mean it's the right model, but just like a generalizable model, without being personalized nutrition, this would be some generalizable things that you would take. And this is something I would encourage everyone to do. Actually, these are all something I would encourage everyone to do. If you don't want to do caffeinated tea, if you want to do decaffeinated teas, those are fine. Those are rich in flavonoids too. You can be more specific in the tea you use. The only thing I would tell you is do not use decaffeinated coffee. Don't have your patients use decaffeinated coffee. The chemicals that are used to decaffeinate coffee are horrendous. You don't want to drink them, okay? Just dilute your coffee more, okay? Or just drink regular coffee, but not the whole cup. You're better off drinking a quarter of a cup of regular coffee than an entire cup of decaffeinated coffee, okay? So remember, decaffeinated coffee is still 40 to 60% caffeinated. It's not non-caffeinated. There's no such thing as non-caffeinated coffee. It has caffeine. It just has less, and the amount of chemicals that are in there to make it less are horrendous. So beware of those. Now, the other last part of this is to talk about nutraceuticals that support resiliency. Oh, by the way, here's a great study before we get into that. Tea and coffee polyphenols impact on aging. This was a review paper, and it just showed how powerful these tea polyphenols are on enhancing immune function, protecting against inflammation and senescence. And then this was just a study on EPA and DHA, showing all the different effects that it has: anti-tumor effects, brain function, blood pressure, anti-inflammatory effects, regulation of gluten metabolism, enhanced exercise time performance, protects against nephrotoxicity, lipid metabolism. So again, this is why I was on that pleiotropic list. Now, let's get into nutraceuticals for resiliency. So remember, everyone has had different degrees of resiliency for different parts of their physiology. Some people have better microbiome resiliency than they have stress resiliency, and some people have better stress resiliency than they have dietary protein resiliency. And a quick way to go through and evaluate that is to use the checklist that we put together for the course. It'll be in the forms section of your course materials. You'll see the list there. You can obviously make your own, make different versions of this, but just to teach the concepts I want to put together there on a checklist. And remember, the key concept with resiliency is in your lifespan, the way you turn on your longevity genes and decrease the negative expressions of the hallmarks of aging is you keep doing things that are stressful to the body. Hormesis, like physical exercise, is stressful to the body. So you get major benefits. Being stuck in cold water is very stressful to the body. The physiology responds against that. So that has benefits in turning on longevity genes. Caloric restriction. Your body goes in the deficit phase where it has to survive. That turns on longevity genes, allowing you to deal with that and try to survive through that period of potentially having no fuel source coming in. So throughout life, anything you do to increase resiliency, or without getting into, which eventually if progresses get into harm, are the things that are critical for us, right? We'll talk about strategies to improve resilience when we get to treatment, but the goal is to, the goal is to get support this benefit part of resiliency build up over time. Now, if you go past your resiliency on an ongoing basis, you can get harm. You can get further degeneration. So if you have a person that has stress resiliency where they fall apart under stress and they continue to stay in that stressful environment, they're going to have oxidative stress, they're going to have all types of inflammatory responses, and they're going to age faster. If someone now requires 8 hours of sleep to function and they're not getting it, they will age faster. If someone has physical resiliency where they can't work out every single day, but they try, they will get injured, and those things will promote aging. So with every single one of these, you have to, the balance is always trying to impact its effect with resiliency and then not doing harm. Now, sometimes nutraceuticals can be helpful in improving resiliency because they support the immune system. It's not the primary thing. So what I did is, we have a questionnaire form with all these different checklists to look at, and then for immune resiliency, here's some protocols. So it depends on what your goals are. But for immune resiliency, micronutrients can help. A, C, D, and A, and zinc are the common nutraceuticals that impact immune function. Things that impact the microbiome have far-reaching effects on impacting the entire immune system. Short-chain fatty acids, butyrate, acetate, propionate, probably being the most significant part of that than anything else, much so more than probiotics or glutamine. And butyrate, acetate, and propionate can also be made by the microbiome from fiber sources. So fiber could be a very good way. And I would say of the top nutrients, vitamin D would probably be the best one for immune resiliency. Vitamin A is really up there. Actually, I think vitamin C is way up there too. If you look at vitamin C, vitamin C is not cool anymore. It's not popular. It's kind of outdated. But if you look at the amount of research on it, and even meta-analysis studies done on vitamin C, it has a profound impact on immune function and immune system health. It just shows vitamin C can't prevent like the common cold, but they clearly have shown in studies that it reduces the length of a common cold and has major effects on just general immune function and health. So C, A, and D are really important. Someone has immune resiliency issues, getting their gut to function, especially fiber and short-chain fatty acids are very useful. Probiotics are hit or miss. Some probiotics work with certain genotypes of the gut, some don't. Glutamine helps support the immune system. These are especially important for your frail, older, elderly patients that don't really have much muscle mass. Glutamine can also help build their nitrogen balance to help them get more protein mass, and help with leaky gut. But the major effect for really calming down inflammation and generalizing bumping immune system will be through fiber and short-chain fatty acids. And then just nutraceuticals for different things a person may be dealing with. So for anti-mold properties, here's all the different nutraceuticals that have anti-mold properties: caprylic acid, oregano, olive leaf, lavender oil. Some people are just still breathing in mold spores. They have mold spores that they have to break down. These can be useful. Antibacterial, antiparasitics, wormwood, black walnut, garlic extract have all been shown to have natural antibacterial properties. And then things that increase natural killer cells are typically useful for supporting antiviral properties: astragalus, echinacea, licorice root, lemon balm, maitake mushrooms. These are some of the most common things that help with antiviral properties. So when you're trying to look at, hey, this person's immune resiliency is down, what are some nutraceuticals you can use? This would be the list. Okay. Now, if someone has microbiome resiliency down, where their microbiome is so sensitive to any kind of dietary change, any kind of hormonal imbalance, any changes in exercise, any amounts of psychological stress, they can't tolerate prebiotics, probiotics, or any kind of fiber, you gotta go very slow with them. But ideally, these would be the most important things for microbiome resiliency: butyrate, propionate, acetate for sure. Now, anyone that has microbiome resiliency, you've got to supplement things carefully. Like if you're using short-chain fatty acids, and let's say you use a capsule for whatever manufacturer you like to use, you might use 2 or 3 with an average person. You might use 1 or half a capsule, and say if you get 1 and you notice bloating or distension, back off. Okay. Same with fiber. Some people that have microbiome resiliency, they can't handle a lot of fiber, so you might have to go very small doses of fiber powder or psyllium husk or whatever you're using. Inulin, apopectin. So you see fiber down here. That can be very supportive. And then if you have tight junction issues, glutamine, zinc carnosine, gamma-rosin can be helpful. But if you look at the literature, the only thing really published that helps tight junctions grow is also short-chain fatty acids. Zinc carnosine has some potential. Probiotics may be beneficial, but it's hit or miss, and you got to be careful if people have microbiome imbalances. But these are things you want to try from a nutraceutical point of view. Now, there are things that cause microbiome loss of resiliency. There's things that cause immune loss of resiliency. We're going to talk about those when we get into the evaluation part of the lecture. Right now, we're just focused on nutraceuticals. Okay. Then you have people that have loss of stress resiliency. They can't handle stress. And from a nutraceutical point of view, adaptogens are obviously something to consider. Rhodiola, holy basil leaf extract, panax ginseng, ashwagandha are things to consider. For the HP axis pathway, phosphatidylserine seems to have good benefits. And then sometimes people have lots of stress resiliency. They really need to just activate their GABA pathways. GABA dampens the limbic responses of stress. Most anti-anxiety medications are GABA agonists. There's some nutraceuticals that have direct GABA receptor binding properties that are used as anti-anxiety anxiolytics, I should say, anti-anxiety supplements. And those include passion flower, valerian, chamomile, L-theanine, lithium orotate. And then potassium, magnesium is always good. People that can't handle stress response, they have some sedative natural properties that can calm people down. So this would be the list to help someone with stress resiliency mechanisms from a nutraceutical point of view. Remember, I keep saying from a nutraceutical point of view because clinically you can always go, why do they have their resiliency issues involved? Well, can you go deeper from a functional medicine point of view? But the focus right now is just on nutraceuticals. Now, for people that have lost their cognitive resiliency, they're heading down Alzheimer's, dementia pathways. There's lots of nutraceuticals that can be used, EPA, DHA for sure. These nutraceuticals can all also be preventive for pathways associated with Alzheimer's disease development in many studies. We went over this list in detail in the Cognitive Decline course for the Crosby Institute and the studies associated with them. You want to definitely support methylation, B12, folate, trimethylglycine, B vitamins. Compounds that support blood flow to the brain are very helpful. People have cognitive resiliency. Vinpocetine, ginkgo extract, things that support acetylcholine activity. These compounds impact acetylcholinesterase pathways that increase acetylcholine levels in the synaptic cleft, huperzine A, alpha GPC, and acetylcarnitine actually binds to acetylcholine receptor that's an agonist. And then botanicals that have shown to have neuroprotective effects, bacopa being one of the main ones, and then things that support neuroinflammation. It overlaps the pleiotropic compounds, resveratrol, curcumin, glutathione, green tea extract. And if you have people that are dealing with toxicological resiliency issues, you really have two options. You have to, number one, get them on things that have antioxidant properties, and number two, support phase 1, phase 2. Now, when toxic compounds come in, they have to be converted to water-soluble compounds. As a matter of fact, one of the things that makes a compound toxic is it's fat-soluble, so your body cannot eliminate it until it becomes water-soluble. Once it's water-soluble, it can be eliminated through feces, urine, and sweat. The first part of biotransforming a compound into a water-soluble, excretable state is for it to go to phase 1. In phase 1 pathways, it's all about antioxidants. It's oxidation reduction pathways. Phase 2, when you have methylation, sulfation, glutathione conjugation, glucuronidation, acetylation, you need different nutraceuticals for that. And then you have to have proper bile elimination. So when people have toxicological resilience, you want to use a high amount of antioxidants. How much? As much as you need. So there's people that you have to go on very, very high levels of antioxidants so they stop reacting to the environment. There's some trial and error involved. It's not based on body weight. It's not based on degree of symptoms. It's based on trial and error. And then nutraceutical support phase 1, phase 2, milk thistle, sulfur amino acids, B vitamins, dandelion root. Those are the main compounds for phase 1, phase 2. And then if people have dietary protein resiliency, if they have increased reactions to different foods, that's loss of immune tolerance. And if they can't digest protein foods, that's usually lack of HCl. If they can't digest fatty foods, that's usually like inefficient gallbladder, bowel release, bowel function. They can't digest high starch foods, it's most likely pancreatic enzymes. So here's just a list, for protein issues, HCl, digestive starch issues, pancreatic enzymes, digestive fat issues, lipase, bile salts. For gallbladder, sludge, dandelion roots, bile salts, support oral tolerance. This is short-chain fatty acids, vitamin D, vitamin A. Glutamine, zinc, carnosine. We talk about oral tolerance a lot in the Crosby Institute autoimmune course in more detail. And then for inflammatory resiliency, people that just have pain all the time, stiffness and pain all the time, increased symptoms of brain fog, you always have to consider the fact that they just may have inflammaging, that they have too much protein aggregates there. And we're going to talk about getting into physiology of what fasting does to autophagy. So anytime someone has concerns that their inflammation is getting much, much worse with mechanisms that explain it, you always have to consider inflammaging and trying to turn on autophagy with extended fasting periods as interventions. But nutraceutically, there's different mechanisms of inflammation that you also want to look at. So flavonoids can be used to dampen inflammation. Resveratrol, curcumin, quercetin, green tea, grapeseed are all great. But another pathway to dampen inflammation is through modulating prostaglandins. So monounsaturated fatty acids like EPA, DHA, flaxseed oil, olive oil, antioxidants, especially glutathione can be very helpful. And then short-chain fatty acids to modulate regulatory T cell functions and vitamin D. These can all be important pathways to support for immune resiliency issues. And then for people that have physical resiliency issues where they're having a really hard time recovering from workouts and physical tasks and their endurance time is reduced, a lot of times just because their mitochondria is inefficient. So antioxidants to quench oxidative stress can be helpful. Especially if you have people that have muscle cramping, muscle fatigue, magnesium, potassium, malic acid, calcium can be very useful. Malic acid is definitely something to consider people that have just stiffness in their muscles all the time, as well as inflammaging that we talked about. Vinpocetine, hawthorn extract to help support nitric oxide pathways can help with physical support and resiliency. And then when you look at blood sugar resiliency issues where people either fatigue after they eat a meal or they really fall apart in between meals, you can look at various nutraceuticals. Now, if someone has insulin resistance where they eat a meal and fatigue and pass out, berberine is definitely on top of the list. Vanadium, chromium, biotin, L-carnitine, B vitamins, and inositol, they all support insulin signaling. But for people that fall apart in between meals, and even for those that have insulin resistance, fiber will help slow down glucose uptake in the gut and slow down spikes. So flaxseed, psyllium, gorgum with meals or in between meals can be a great way to stop blood sugar falls and spikes, help with their resiliency. And also branched-chain amino acids. Leucine, leucine, valine could be a good way to help stabilize blood sugars in between meals. So those are things to consider. And then when people start to lose their sleep resiliency, can't fall asleep, can't recover from sleep, as many hours of sleep, at least from a nutraceutical point of view, the main thing you're trying to do to keep them in their deep REM sleep is to inhibit their reticular activating system, which is a pathway that's inhibited through GABA activity. So back to natural GABA agonists, the valerian root, passion flower, chamomile tea, the L-theanine, these are the typical compounds people use as natural sleep aids. Magnesium, potassium can also be helpful for those sleep resiliency pathways. Okay, so, you may not be able to, and in summary, when we talk about these things, you may not be able to, get the resiliency fixed with a nutraceutical. But it could be one of the things you can help. And for some people, it could make a big difference in their clinical case. But it's not the approach. Remember, when we do a functional medicine or a personalized medicine approach, we're trying to figure out why someone has lost their resiliency. What are the things that are driving their resiliency loss? But in the meantime, what are some things we can do to improve their function or improve their resiliency with what they have? Some people may never get their resiliency back for some certain pathways. Some people may always have stress resiliency issues. Some people may always have a need to take antioxidants to function. Some people may always be prone to hypoglycemia and have to have high fibery meals and even take fiber supplements between meals based on where they are in their longevity span and their health span. So whatever you can do to improve function. Because if you can find ways to support resiliency nutraceutically and they don't exceed it, then you're going to slow down their aging process too. So if they can take adaptogens and there's the other compounds and the stress response is not as bad, and now if they take those things, even though they're under stress, they can actually still sleep, they can still actually recover from workouts, then that's better for them than if they can't sleep and can't recover from workouts when they're stressed, and now they have this aging cascade perpetuate. So remember, the summary is of all the nutraceuticals we talked about are nutraceuticals that impact longevity genes and pathways, nutraceuticals that impact the hallmarks of aging. We talked about thinking about it from a pleiotropic effect. If you're going to be generalizable just to all those pathways, these would make the most sense based on the current evidence. And remember that the people that have different degrees of resiliency, and if you want, you can use the checklist and then go through each of the resiliency patterns themselves to look at which nutraceuticals to incorporate. So those are the main concepts that I wanted to cover in this section of the course. And once again, I just want to point out, nutraceuticals is not the only way. We have to incorporate other types of factors. The next lecture, we're going to really get into lifestyle and environmental factors. Then we get into evaluation and treatment. We're going to really incorporate various things, and it definitely is not all about nutraceuticals. So nutraceuticals are just one part of interventions that we can use to support these hallmark of aging pathway expressions.